Carolina Risotto.
What's up, guys? I'm Carolina Risotto, and welcome back to No Ducks Given podcast, the podcast where we speak openly and honestly about the highs and lows in life because vulnerability is a superpower, not a weakness. Today's guest is Calvin Wayman. He's an author, public speaker, entrepreneur, and ex-cult member. He grew up as a fundamentalist Mormon with one dad, 4 moms, and he has a total of 44 siblings. Today, Calvin is living in New York City, and his goal is to empower people to think for themselves and to live a life that's their own. So today, we're going to find out if you might be in a cult. Calvin, thank you so much for joining us.
So pumped to be here, Carolina.
We met a few years ago in LA, which is kind of crazy. I think when we met, you had just left the cult.
Uh-huh.
So I think to start off, I want you to explain to our audience, what is a cult? And just like a general point of view.
That's a loaded question because everyone already has some idea of what a cult is. Usually when people think of a cult, they think of usually this central figurehead, this person that's like manipulating a whole group of people. And that is true. Like there are cults like that. But having grown up in a cult and left it just 5 years ago, one thing I've realized is cultiness is not just black and white. It's on a spectrum. I like the word culty because there are a lot of things in society perhaps that look culty, and some things that are culty used to not be culty and then they get more and more cult-like, but I'll table that for a sec. But some of the things that make up a cult. There's incredibly strong in-group, out-group dynamics. For example, in a cult, people inside of it believe something that makes them special, or multiple things that make them special. And everybody else on the outside of that are like certainly not as cool, not as special. Sometimes they're dismissed entirely. It feels like you're in like this super special club and you're so lucky that you get to be in on this club. That's one major thing. In-group, out-group dynamics. The other thing is there's some sort of centralized authority or something that everybody in the group looks towards. Sometimes that is an individual. So you've heard of, like, there's all sorts of cults on Netflix, different documentaries, and usually there's one figure, one person that's in charge of the whole cult. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's an idea that the cult worships. Sometimes it's a group of people that the cult worships. In my case, it was more of a group, like several men that were at the top. Usually there's incredibly high stakes. High stakes for being in. This can also be tied to the in-group, out-group dynamics, but the stakes are high for being in, and they're incredibly high, maybe even devastating to be out of it. So, I mean, I'm sure we'll probably get into different things of how those things play in my cult or other cults. And if it's more exclusive, that's cultier. If it's less accepting, that's cultier. If it's more of like, our idea is the only good idea, like this centralized person is almost like a god, the more that's revered, the cultier it becomes.
It sounds pretty similar to many of the dynamics we see in society, right?
Yeah.
In politics, we praise a president.
Oh, yeah. I'm not saying every political circle is culty, but it can kind of be on some level if you if free-flowing ideas aren't possible. If you feel threatened socially by having some idea that's different from the group, that, based on the way I look at it, that might be a little culty.
Okay, so it seems like the main characteristic of a cult is lack of freedom of expression.
That's a major one, right? Because, like, for example, the cult that I was in, Fundamentalist Mormonism, over time, you lose your individuality. Because what matters most is adhering to the principles of that cult. And the entire group, not just the figurehead, the person at the top, Now it is top down in some sense where oftentimes they dictate this is how we behave, but they're not always the one policing. Who is policing? Sometimes most of the time, in my experience, it's the other cult members. It's the other people in the group that, because you are deviating from the script, so to speak, of how you're supposed to be in this group, then people are going to like shun you or like put you in line. And yeah, over time, you lose your individuality and you sacrifice that for the greater whole, for the group.
Okay, we're definitely getting to brainwashing levels here.
Yes.
That's really scary. So I think one of the scariest parts of being in a cult must be not knowing that you are in a cult.
Oh yeah. There's this saying that I love. Two fish are swimming past an older fish. And the older fish says to the younger fish, "How's the water, boys?" And the two young fish are like confused. They swim away. And then finally one of them breaks silence and says, "What the hell is water?" In other words, the last creature on the planet to discover water is a fish because it's so ever present. That same principle applies.
Wow, that is scary.
Yes. The last person on the planet to know that it's a cult is typically the cult member. Like, there's a reason I lived 30 years, my entire life, in it.
And what age did you start realizing you were in a cult? How long did it take for you to get out?
So where it really started was like early 20s. So it took me roughly 8 years to process it.
So like in your early 20s, you first had that realization that like, wait, there's something off. And then by the time you were 30, you were kind of like, okay, I need to get out.
Yeah, took a college class. It was like what I called a crack. And from there, with a lot of studying, a lot of traveling the world, a lot of meeting other people, to the point I left was about 8 years.
Wow. Okay. It's crazy that the brain takes time to process things and to understand what's happening. So the fact that it took that long, which for many people will probably not be that long because some people never leave the cult. So the fact that you left is like amazing.
Oh, yeah. Most people stay in it because it's all they know. It's their reality. It almost feels like death and it certainly did for me at certain points. The concept, the thought of leaving it felt dangerous, not even just to my physical well-being, but to at the time, my soul, my entire existence felt like if I actually left this, I'm a goner.
It's that classic saying that if you're in a toxic relationship, you probably don't even know.
I love that you bring that up because I compare cultness to a toxic relationship all the time because people look at cults and they're curious about it, but they're like, there's no way I could never see myself in a cult. Like it's just for dumb people and stuff like that. Hold on. No one on this planet got into a relationship to have a toxic one. Like that wasn't the plan. Nobody really plans on joining or being in a cult. So how does it happen? Well, here's one thing that's not talked about enough in relationships or cults. And it's like, there's actually a lot of good stuff in it. Yes, there's mind washing or mind games and brainwashing, but there is something that people are getting that there's some payoff that somebody gets in the relationship they're in. And that's what makes it toxic because they know it's not good for them in the long run. But because there's like love bombing or they feel good about themselves or this sense of security, that's where the toxicity comes in. My upbringing as a kid and everything, like it was awesome for the most part. I was never alone given how many siblings I had. 44 siblings, all in the same house, on a farm, one dad, 4 moms.
How big was this house?
Not as big as it should have been, probably. We were quite tight. It was quite close living quarters when I was young. I was the baby when we moved to the house, but when I was about 12 or 13, we built an addition to the house and made it like 4 or 5 times bigger. So we're talking 12 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms. Each of the parents had their own room. So that's 5 rooms right there. But the kids couldn't. So I was always in a bedroom with like 3 to 6 of my older brothers.
Okay, so you mentioned each of the parents had their own room. I understand that, the 44 siblings is from a polygamy, right? Your dad had multiple wives.
Fundamentalist Mormonism practices polygamy.
I didn't think that they all lived in the same house together.
That's because it doesn't always happen that way. A lot of fundamentalist Mormon families will have different houses, but there are many, certainly in my church, where everybody lived in one house. Every family that I grew up with, my uncles, like literally anyone that I knew, they lived in the same house. There was not like multiple houses for multiple wives. It was like one family with 3 wives or 4 wives or 5 wives, or in my grandfather's case, 15 wives.
15?
At least. He has at least 15 wives, yeah.
That's a full-time job.
Oh, yeah.
And the women are okay with that?
That is a loaded question.
They're supposed to be okay because it's part of the cult, right? It's accepted in the cult.
There's so much to unpack, and we don't even have the time to go into all of that. But this is what I will say: that if you ask them, they are more than okay with it. They believe it is the way to live. It's all they've known. Yes, there's challenges. Yes, there's jealousy between wives sometimes and all that, but they view it perhaps because of the conditioning or how it's been taught for 4 generations. Because again, the cult I was from was a 4-generation cult. They feel that it is almost a spiritual practice to overcome the tendencies for jealousy, and that this is the way to live to get to heaven. Not just heaven, the highest heaven. Because in fundamentalist Mormonism and regular Mormonism, which my church and regular Mormonism, there's going to be a lot of people that watch this that are in the comments saying, just so you know, we're separate. Well, let me say this. We are way closer than people realize. Fundamentalist Mormonism is birthed out of the LDS Church. The only reason Fundamentalist Mormonism exists is because of the LDS Church. We can go into that a little bit later. But from the very beginning of the founding of Joseph Smith, through Brigham Young, the second founder, and beyond, polygamy was put on a pedestal as this is the way to live to get to the highest heaven. And we were taught that Jesus really had multiple wives, even like, so shocker, everybody thought he was single. Like every woman mentioned Mary Magdalene, like like every woman almost that is mentioned around Jesus, we were taught that's actually his wife. But the world just wasn't ready to know yet. So that's why it's like when Passion of the Christ came out, the Mel Gibson movie around Jesus, like my church loved that. They were like, yeah, Mel Gibson, we think he secretly knows. And he did such a good job of like showing Jesus's wives. But at any rate, there's also other stories in the Bible of people that had multiple wives. And so it was taught and believed that it's the premier way for society to live.
But why is it that men can have multiple partners and women can't?
God didn't ordain. It's not about fairness. It's about what God ordained.
So it's not even about sexism. It's just because God said so.
Yes. And in the Bible, God said, multiply and replenish the earth. And so that means have kids. In fundamentalist belief systems, Mormonism is probably one of the most comforting religions on the planet if you believe everything it says. Because when you're born, you know exactly where you came from. You know the life you were living in heaven. You know exactly what this life is all about. And you know exactly where you're going after. Like, life is so fucking complicated. Can you, like, the universe, and like, there's so many questions we don't know the answers to, but like, imagine, like, if you actually just all of a sudden knew all these answers, it just feels so good, right? And one of the answers, and this ties back to the polygamy thing, is we were taught that we were all souls without bodies in heaven, part of our soul's evolution is to get a body. We were also taught that God himself had a body that had been celestialized, that he went through the same process that we are now going through, that he was like a spirit soul baby that got a human body at some other point in some other universe, and he kept evolving and evolving and evolving, and then eventually became a God. That's what we want too. We saw our Father in heaven and we're like, we want to be like you. We don't just want to be in your presence like most Christian churches. We want to be a God ourselves. What a freaking great reward. Like, that's what we were taught, that you can someday be a God yourself. So we were taught that we were in the spirit world, in heaven, we wanted a body. And how do you get a body? By having kids, by somebody birthing you. And so we believed that the only way to get those souls here, like they're waiting, they're in heaven waiting to come here. Why would you be so selfish and put on a condom? Like, let them come. That's literally how it was. Like, why would you play God? That's playing God almost, to have any sort of contraceptive. Like, and again, that's why polygamy, because it takes one man and however many wives he can have to have a lot of babies.
And you can't impregnate multiple women at the same time because they need like 9 months to have the baby, but the guy can keep it going. So that makes sense.
Yes. You mean if a woman had multiple husbands? You can't have multiple.
Yeah, like you can bring more people on earth if the guy is having sex with multiple women.
Yes.
Great logic.
Yeah.
Well, it makes sense. Like, for looking from that point of view, it makes sense.
The truth is, and this is with a lot of stories, once you put in a few very unreasonable assumptions, then you just use logic, it actually plays out. But of course, it was the underlying assumptions. Like, it actually sounds like if you believe the assumption that there are spirits on the other side waiting to come here, and then you're like, okay, and our job's to get them here. Well, you have like, that feels logical. But of course, what we have to do is assess the assumption of like, how do we know that there are souls on the other in heaven waiting to come?
But then after these souls make it on earth, then they have the opportunity to become a god like Jesus.
Yes, because in Mormonism, God and Jesus are very distinct, separate beings. There's no Trinity or that sort of thing. It's God the Father, a physical person, thing, being, and then there's his actual son. And so Jesus, what his job is basically just to point back to the Father. He's like a great big older brother. And yes, we don't just want to be like Jesus. We want to be like Jesus because Jesus is like the closest to becoming like his Father, closest to becoming like a God. But we want to become a God. We want to have our own universe, our own planet, multiple planets. We want to continually progress in this life and the life beyond.
Okay, so basically polygamy became a thing because you're helping populate the earth, and then you're giving them the opportunity to become gods, and you're spreading the message of your cult, which you wouldn't call a cult if you're in it, but you're spreading that message, and you're also getting a shitload of siblings.
Yeah, so that's what now, is that how it started? That's where the water gets a little bit muddier. And that's like, as I started to study, I realized where it actually came from. The founder, Joseph Smith, when he was married, got caught having sex with a 14-year-old girl named Fanny Alger in the barn by her uncle. He was supposed to be a prophet, and so he's the leader of this church, and everybody's up in arms saying this is a false prophet. And so what does he come up with? This story that actually an angel came with a drawn sword and said, I must marry this woman. I didn't want to. I'm in love with my wife, Emma, and he was going to kill me if I didn't because I'm supposed to be a polygamist. And that's how it came from. It was like a cover-up story. What I'm speaking right now is almost blasphemous to say in the LDS Church, but it's the truth, because that's the other thing that is so troubling and frustrating about the culture I come from, the LDS Church particularly, that they whitewash the history so much. There's so many people in the LDS Church the Mormon church that we all know that the Broadway show here in New York City is based on, that don't even know that there were polygamists. They're like, oh yeah, it used to be a thing. And then they invent stories of like, oh, it was just something that was done because a lot of men were dying and they needed to get married to someone. So there was a shortage of men. Not true. It's because it was a belief that Joseph Smith started, that Brigham Young perpetuated, that they thought that was the one way to live, that they were going to live forever until they were trying to gain statehood. And the federal government was like, we're not giving you statehood. In fact, we're going to start seizing your properties because this is not the way. This seems barbaric, right in line with slavery. And then all of a sudden, one of the after teaching it for a couple generations that this is the one way, this is the one way, this is the one way, one of the church leaders says, we're not going to live polygamy anymore. They started telling the federal government, oh, we're not doing it anymore. And they got some revelation that God said, it's not required anymore. Mm-hmm. And then they actually did it. They kept living it secretly. The church leaders, even though they told the federal government, we're done, we're not doing it anymore. Here's our revelation on it. But then the church was still secretly living it. And the word got out and they're like, we're hearing that polygamy marriages are still happening. We're not giving you statehood. And there was a lot of pressure. And there were court cases about it and everything. And then finally, they actually did, at least from a leadership position, say, you know what? Absolutely, we're not doing it. And they stopped doing it. But they now had a population in the church, followers, that were polygamist, that had families, that were taught that the reason they're polygamous is so they can get to the highest degree of heaven. They still wanted it. And so followers were like, well, my leaders said to stop living it, but we're not breaking up our families. We're going to keep living it. And because of the pressure from the government to the LDS Church excommunicated their own members that were living the way that they taught them. That's where my church exists. And this is for anybody watching that is actually curious about LDS Church and Mormonism, or if you are an LDS member, this is the actual truth. This is the actual, truth is such a loaded word. This is the history. Look it up. That's actually what happened. And so people say all the time that, oh, fundamentalist Mormonism and Mormonism are so separate. No. Fundamentalist Mormonism came out of the LDS Church, and it happened when a passionate minority within the LDS Church decided to keep living what they were taught because they had a testimony for it, and their church leaders excommunicated them, and then fundamentalist Mormonism was born. That's where I come from.
So in 1830, Joseph Smith founded the Mormon Church, which originally was not supposed to be, polygamous, but it became after he got caught cheating on his wife with a 14-year-old. He created this whole idea that you're gonna become a god or whatever if you're spreading polygamy and having multiple wives. But then years later, the church decided to change its core essence of polygamy, and then was like, you know what? That's not a thing anymore. We're gonna be faithful, let's say, even though people are not these days anyway. But we're gonna be faithful.
By faithful, you mean monogamous?
Monogamous, yeah. We're gonna be monogamous. Thank you. And then the people who were taught that polygamy was okay and already had their families built around polygamy, they were basically excommunicated. And that's how the fundamentalist Mormonism came about.
In the late 1800s, yes.
So the core essence is the same. Would you say the biggest difference between them is the polygamy?
There's a lot of similarities still. There are a bunch of little differentiations that have happened over time, because fundamentalism, they're proud of sticking to their guns. They're proud of sticking to the original teachings, especially of Joseph Smith, who was a polygamist. When you really dig into it and you look at the events as they took place, though, there is no stories talking about polygamy until after he got caught.
So let's go back to your childhood. Growing up with that many siblings, didn't it ever call your attention that you had 44 siblings and, I don't know, maybe your next door neighbor didn't?
Yeah, but it was still normal because the way we were raised, again, we were special. Just like at the beginning of the episode, talking about like we were special because we knew the truth. We knew that there was the outside world that everybody in the outside world we called the Gentiles. We knew Gentiles did not know the truth like we did. So of course they're just going to be a single child with a 2-parent household. Like that, they don't know any better.
You pitied them almost.
Oh yeah.
Like they're not going to heaven. They're not going to become gods. We are.
Well, secretly, especially when I was a teenager, I kind of hoped, I wished that I got to be my next door neighbor for a different reason. I'll just give a quick aside on that, because we were also taught that you're judged based on the knowledge God has given you. So if you didn't know any better, you can't be judged for it. So it's better to never have heard the truth versus you were told the truth and then you turned away from it. For example, if I lived like my next door neighbor, the next door neighbor's okay because they never knew the truth that this is the church, this is my prophet, this is the way the life is. But they have a chance still to hear the truth either in this life or even in the next life. That's a whole other conversation that they get, that every soul is going to have a chance to be saved, to hear the Mormon truth. That's why there's like baptism, like there's this whole thing in Mormonism, baptizing for the dead, because they're trying to get everybody saved. Like, so it was somewhat normal that we had neighbors that only had 1 or 2 kids, but everybody that I knew, that I grew up with, my cousins, my grandfather, they had big families too. So it was just normal.
And you didn't spend time with those other kids that weren't part of...
I was homeschooled.
You were homeschooled and you only spent time with your siblings or your cult community.
By the time I was 20 years old, 99% of the human beings that I knew had the last name Wayman. My name is Calvin Wayman. My same last name. We lived in a fenced yard, never left the yard, didn't even go walk the streets, on a dead-end road. If we saw cars coming down the street, we were taught to hide behind the bushes or run in the house so that the world did not know we were polygamists, because we knew that it was illegal. We also knew that the devil wanted to, get us in trouble because we're the one true church left. Like, I have great grandparents on both sides, on both of my biological parent sides, that have spent time in jail for their religious beliefs. So the outside world was like scary. It was threatening. It was not your friend. And so the only people you really hung out with were people that were living the same way you were.
You can go to jail for being polygamous?
You can in Utah. Not anymore, but the laws were created because of the pressure of who's the state made of? Mormons.
I'm alarmed about what you said earlier, that like cars would drive by and you would be hiding.
Oh, yeah.
So you would basically hide your existence from the external world?
Totally. In fact, I have this story that I'll never forget. I didn't realize I just knew we were supposed to not tell them the whole truth somehow when I was really little. And I remember my dad saw me and my younger brother talking to a neighbor kid. This feels so primal, but literally, if he wanted everybody to come to my dad, he would whistle. And if you heard a whistle, you frickin' run and get to him. You don't walk, you run. And he saw us at the end of the yard, my younger brother and I, talking to a neighbor kid. And he whistled. And he ran, and he knew that, because he didn't want us talking to a neighbor, because he didn't want us to tell the neighbors that we had at the time, not 4 moms, 3 moms. But this is the funny part. My little brother, Johnny, had told the neighbor that we had 3 moms. And my dad was livid. And I remember saying, "Oh, but don't worry, because I told the neighbor kid, 'No, we don't, Johnny. We don't have 3. We only have 2. And I thought that was like, I did a good thing. But I just remember my dad like laughing. And I was like, wait, was that not quite right? I mean, I did lie. Wasn't that the point? But it's like, no, that's still polygamy. Anyway, yeah, we were taught to like not let other people know. And I didn't tell anyone. I went all through college, maybe telling one or two people, kind of, but not even fully going deep into it because I was so conditioned that do not cast pearls before swine. They're not ready for it. They're not in it. So
You pity them, but it's not your responsibility to tell them.
pity, not my responsibility, and for my own security.
Your own protection.
Because if I tell them, they could tell law enforcement. Law enforcement could do whatever. My parents could go to jail.
People always put like human life or human safety into the game as a form of manipulation because it's the biggest fear. It's dying. However, if you die, you become a god in your religion. So not so bad.
We weren't afraid of death. We were afraid of hell. That was it, because hell was like eternal.
But you would go to hell if you told your neighbors about your religion?
Not really, but I guess I'm just responding to your comment about how manipulation is used. And if we want to get into some of that, we can. But the way I was super manipulated, and a lot of people in cults are manipulated, certainly within Fundamentalist Mormonism, is this fear of going to hell forever.
Okay, so what gets you into hell in Fundamentalist Mormonism?
Leaving.
Okay.
You leave the church, you could go to hell. In fact, that was a big one. And just look at that as like a manipulation tactic, right?
Absolutely.
You're judged based on what God gave you. You're judged based on the knowledge God gave you. God loved you enough, Calvin, that you got to be born in the one true church. That's because I fought valiantly in the previous existence, that I fought for Jesus's plan, not Lucifer's plan. And I got to come here. And God said, this is the one true church. You have church leaders that have this special power called the priesthood. The priesthood is God's power to speak on God's behalf on the earth. Unless you have the priesthood, you're not speaking for God. You're speaking from a place of your own humanity. The only way to truly speak with authority of God is to have this thing called the priesthood. You were born where the priesthood is, in the one true church. That is a massive gift. You have this gift that is so good that if people knew how good it was, they would be clawing to get into this church. This is how I'm stopped. And because you were given so much, if you turn away from it, it's like giving God the finger. And so that's why you can be damned, because it's such a good thing that you were given. You have the truth. And the one sin that you can't sin against, we called it sinning against the Spirit of the Holy Ghost. You actually not only heard the truth, you accepted the truth. You had a testimony that this is the truth. And if you once ever believed that this is the truth, God revealed it to you and you owned it, and then you turn away, you sinned against the Holy Ghost. That's the worst. That's worse than rape or murder. And so you're going to go to hell and you'll be cast into outer darkness.
Okay, so the biggest thing that would get you to hell in fundamentalist Mormonism would be to leave the group.
That's one of them.
What are the other reasons?
Like murder and stuff like that. But the thing that's really strange is there's all these stories of like, but you can still like redeem yourself somehow. But it's usually things like, again, sinning against the Holy Ghost, which is going against what God revealed to you, going against one of the church leaders and saying like, fuck John Timpson, or something disrespectful to whoever's higher up. That's really it. And there's probably a bigger list, but it's just like, if you haven't repented, there's some things you can't repent of. I think growing up, I feel like my parents taught that sex before marriage was something like that. Like I was terrified of falling in love, because if I fell in love, that would mean I might want to hold her hand. But if I held her hand, we might be close. And if I'm close, I might want to kiss her. Holy crap. What if I kissed her? What if kissing leads to sex? And we weren't married. Oh my gosh, I'm going to hell.
You can go to hell if you leave Mormonism or if you have sex before marriage. This is starting to sound like a lot of religions out there.
Totally.
There's a lot of religions that are borderline culty. Like if they're
Good word.
If they're telling you to, not have your own individual thoughts, to follow one and only leader, and controlling you to that point, as we're describing here, you might be in a cult. Even if it's not popularly called a cult, it might be. Because even fundamentalist Mormonism, to them, it's not a cult.
Dude, this is a strange thing. I've been out for 5 years. It's been a year. It's only been the last year that it's clicked for me that it is a cult. 5 years post, 4 years out. Like it is a lot there's a lot of layers to take off. And when you hear cult, the other thing that's so fascinating about being in a cult, it is so easy to spot other cults. Like, it was easy. It was so easy.
But would you call it a cult?
Probably. Like, there were other fundamentalist Mormon churches that we knew. And we knew that they were obviously wrong. But we weren't. Like, what was really funny for me, sometime right before I left, it was actually really close to when I decided to leave. I was living in the southern Utah, northern Arizona area at the time, which is where my church is headquartered. People may know of Colorado City, Arizona. That's like infamous of where Warren Jeffs, who's a fundamentalist Mormon church leader. Thankfully, he was never my prophet. His church and the church I was born into was once the same church, but then there was a split off because of leadership disputes over who actually had the true church, which is another like consistent pattern in fundamentalist Mormonism. But I had a couple friends come stay with me that I met at some business conference. And they were coming to stay with me because they were going to go to the Grand Canyon or Zion or something like that. And this was before it really clicked to me what I was in. And I was driving them around town. Now, keep in mind, there's something, the Warren Jeffs Church, that a lot of people will know the name of. There's a documentary called Keep Sweet on Netflix, Fundamentalist Mormonism, like that's where this area is. And I was living down there, and I was driving my friends through Colorado City, which is a neighboring cult to the cult that I'm from. I had already started opening up, telling people about my upbringing, my beliefs, my questions around it. So they knew a little bit already about my own beliefs and what I was taught. But I was driving them through the neighboring cult, telling them how it was so strange, how they dressed, and how, because they were more conservative than mine, and like what they believed. And I remember my friends asking, so basically they're the same as yours. And when they said that, I remember like, what? No way. Like, they're way different. They're way different. And they're like, really? How? And they were genuinely confused because they heard me describe mine. Then I'm describing this other one. And it did not occur to me till that moment how similar we actually were. And we literally lived 5 minutes down the road from each other, was once the same church, and we were taught that we're like totally separate. And so it is fascinating how you can be in a cult, you can recognize another cult, that other cult can even look exactly like you and believe almost the exact same fucking things, and you don't see it. And that's literally how it is today, to this day. I have family members, loved ones, that they know for a fact that these other fundamentalist Mormon churches are clearly culty, but we're so lucky that we're in ours, listening to these 6 men that say they speak for God. I'm so lucky that I get to be a part of this. There's no way this could ever be a cult.
It's back to that toxic relationship thing. It's like we say, oh, like when our friends are in a toxic relationship, we will say, that would never happen to me. Like, how could they still be in that relationship? Why haven't they gotten out of it yet? But then it happens to you, and you're the one who can't see it. And I think everyone, at least already in their 20s, has been in at least one toxic relationship.
Yeah. And even if you started to see that it was toxic when you were in it, and that's what ultimately made you leave, this is what I can guarantee you. The longer you are out of it, the more you realize just in fact how toxic it actually was.
Absolutely.
You didn't even know the half of it when you finally left. You were like, it's after leaving it and then self-reflecting and journaling and thank God for therapy that you're like, oh my gosh, why did it take me so long to leave that? You know?
At the end of the day, what matters is that you left and that you found your voice, it seems, today. And you're still finding it. It's a process, right? But I think for myself, even, like, I recently got out of a toxic relationship. And when I say relationship, it could be friendship, it could be romantic, it could be anything. But I got out of it about 2 months ago. And like yesterday, out of nowhere, like a thought came to my mind. I was like, oh, damn, like that was really messed up, wasn't it? Like that moment, like you just have a memory. And so the realization really comes slowly. Like even after you get out of it, like that's just the first of a gazillion steps until you like fully heal and find your identity again and your sense of self.
Yeah. And learn about yourself, learn about human nature and psychology. Like once you learn a little bit about that, you learn about narcissism or like manipulative tendencies and cognitive biases. Then you can look at it with new lens and be like, oh, whoa, I see how that was being played. Like, no wonder people believe it. It's just confirmation bias over and over and over. People aren't leaving the bubble. They're going to church every Sunday, hearing the same story. Nobody's coming in and sharing a different story. So what are they believing? The thing that, like, they're seeing the outside world, but what are they seeing? Destruction, issues. We're the one true safe place. Like, it's just reinforced. It's interesting that as you learn about, again, just your own psychology and what made you believe it, you then see it and be like, okay, I have a little bit more almost compassion and empathy and understanding, like, okay, I see why it's lasting, or why it lasted as long as it did for me.
Anybody, even if it's someone you love very deeply or someone you praise, if they're not letting you have your own form of thinking or letting you explore different options, that's toxic. The world is so big. There's so much to explore. There's so many people to meet and experiences to have. If anybody's stopping you from doing that, that's toxic. Be careful, because there are many little ways that we're brainwashed and manipulated every single day. Let it be by the media or by politics or by a family member. It's everywhere. So like, I think it's really important to just develop your own train of thought in your own individuality. And that takes questioning everything around you for a moment and exploring different options so you can see, like, wait, is this how I really think, or is this how I was taught to think? Let me explore or study a little bit this different subject. And then if you're like, you know what, I think the way that I was originally taught is the way that I actually think, you can go back, but there's no threat to questioning things. Questioning is a positive thing because we're all individuals for a reason. We're on the earth as individuals for a reason, so we can develop our individuality. If we came here as individuals, it's because we have to have an individual experience and individual thoughts.
That's why I love travel, because travel, you just get smacked in the face of something being done a different way or people behaving differently, and then you think about your home differently. But I think what's so helpful, challenging but helpful, is question your internal world too. Ask yourself, why do I believe this? And go a couple layers deep. Because when I was in Fundamentalist Mormonism, I said, well, I believe this because it's the truth. And so you have to start to almost become pseudo-psychologist on your own internal world of being like, I'm believing this because it's the only inputs I'm really getting. Yes, I have access to the internet nowadays and stuff like that, but everything's looked through a Mormon colored glasses. And so you know how to dismiss certain information and you know how to accept other information. Then you start to be like, I think I believe this only because of X, Y, Z. So then you can start to really do something that's really challenging. And that is, I'm going to put myself on neutral footing and see if I would still choose this. That's the only way that I know that you can actually maintain your individuality, is if you can leave it enough, get secure enough with yourself that you can be like, and then choose. Like, I am so cool with whatever anybody believes. I don't give a fuck what somebody believes, but I give a lot of care why you believe it. How did you come to it? What process did you go through? Were you surrounded by it? Did you leave it? Did you toil? And I don't mean that you were around it forever and you went on a mission and confirmed it and got some spiritual experience. Like, what did you actually go through? Did you ever leave it away? Did you actually try on, not just intellectually? Did you actually try a different religion? Did you try different practices? But that's the hard work. Looking into the mirror, looking into yourself and asking, why do I believe what I believe?
The hardest journey of getting out of your comfort zone is the internal journey.
Oh, yeah.
Questioning who you are in your existence is one of the hardest things that you can do, but it's also one of the most rewarding. And I think social media, in a way, kind of has become a little bit cult-like, because think of the algorithm. It gives you more of what you research and of what you already see.
I do not hear people talk about this enough. You're so right.
That's a problem. The algorithm, it doesn't bring you new information. It brings you the same information over and over again.
You're giving me goosebumps. Where this actually started, where I really started to notice this, is I have some family members that are like flat earthers. And I was wondering, how could anybody believe the earth was flat? Because they started watching a YouTube video and they wanted to research more. So how did they research more? Next recommended video. On social media, they're hanging out with their conservative Facebook groups, and it goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And then I saw it like more left-leaning people. You want to hang out and see the type of content that resonates with you. And so that is it's just so important, I think, to recognize that, just be aware of it, that there's no such thing as Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. And what I mean by that is there is your Facebook, there is your YouTube, there is your Twitter. Your Facebook doesn't look like my Facebook. Your Instagram doesn't look like my Instagram. We call it those things and we start talking about it like it's the same thing. It's freaking not. No wonder there are tensions, because people are getting one reality, another group is getting a completely different reality, and each group is like, what the F are you guys talking about? It's not like that at all. It's like this. And it's because quite literally, they're experiencing reality in a different way. That's a very insightful thing, how social media can almost become culty. And it is, and you got to be mindful of it.
Yeah, even like on my Instagram feed, I don't go to the Discover page very often. I usually use social media, honestly, for business. I go there, I post, I comment on my peers' stuff.
You probably have ducks in your Discover.
My Discover page for my podcast is only ducks and motivational quotes.
That's hilarious. Is it really?
I swear to God. If you're using Instagram, they're going to tailor your Discover, and this is for other social media platforms as well, but they're going to tailor your Discovery page to things that you like and that you already consume and know of. So knowledge that you already have, which probably came from the way you grew up or where you are or your friends. So it's either going to be that, or it's going to be based on the people around you, meaning your current social circle, the people that you currently know. So it's never giving you an outside perspective. So how are you going to know to question your reality if those questions and that information is not even available to you? The internet is supposed to empower you, but now it is most likely brainwashing us back into the same state, because most people don't have the curiosity or the courage to question their own reality. So most people will stay in that brainwashy cycle.
We live in a world that it is easier than ever to listen to new perspectives if you're willing to. Don't listen to what the Republicans believe just from Democrats. Go to their channels and see what they're believing. You can get well-rounded views. The problem that we often see is you're usually learning about the other group from your group. That's not the way. Go around and actually consider and listen.
I'm always interested in learning from people who have completely different opinions from mine. That's what I think is more interesting. And then getting to the core of why do you think this way? Because if you get to the core of it, then you can actually empathize or understand a little bit better. I think everybody wants the same. Everybody wants to be happy. Everybody wants love. But we all have different perspectives and point of views because of how we grew up or the information that we were exposed to. So there are different ways to achieve that. For some people, true love and the way, of the world is polygamy. For other people, it's not. I also think travel, going back to the comment that you made before, is such a great way for you to expand your horizons, because you're getting exposed to growing up in completely different ways. Even, I'm Brazilian, and Brazil and the US are very similar in many ways in terms of the content that we consume, but culturally, it is so different. So, and it's in the small things, it's in the subtle things that later on become big things. And sometimes the place where you grow up or the family that you grow up in is not the thing that you're going to identify with the most. So have the courage and the respect for yourself to explore something different, because it's a lot more rewarding than being stuck in a life that's not for you. And the only way for you to find out is by expanding your horizons and looking for that information and searching for those new experiences.
You're dropping mics, Carolina. It's why I love New York City. I love the variety that is constant, because it's just a constant reminder of the world is such a big place. There's so many ways of living this life. But what it ultimately comes down to is like, what do I want? Like, what do I actually want? Not what was I told, not what society said, not what my mom or dad or my mom or my mom or my mom, like, not what anybody said. What do I want? And actually getting honest with that. It's a challenging and very rewarding process.
Something funny about that is that my first guest on the podcast, Angel D, who is all about getting out of her comfort zone. She does like daily comfort zone challenges and stuff. She's super interesting. But in her story, she talks about how she was living the life that her parents wanted, but it was actually the life that she thought that they wanted for her. She just assumed they want me to work in business and get this degree. So sometimes there's not even that pressure and that expectation. You make it up in your head because of what you see around you. And you're like, everyone's doing that. That looks great. That's what I should do too, because then I will be accepted. But sometimes people will just accept you for who you are if you just say, hey, this is who I am, you know? So don't assume that people won't accept you. And give it a try. Try something new. Start asking some questions and see different opinions as well. I think being curious is really important.
Totally. And I'm going to take the other side of the conversation. People will reject you by doing that. You may not get accepted. At least that was in my case. The decision that I made to leave, like overnight, almost 99% of the kids that I grew up with became estranged overnight because of, again, the big difference between in-group, out-group dynamic. They took it very personally when I decided to leave. So how do you do it anyway? Even how do you keep curious? How do you keep trying? I think one thing I've always thought of is that study of people on their deathbed. There's this study of like, what's the number one thing they regret? And it's not that they would have gotten a job or whatever. The number one thing that they regret is not living true to themselves, that they gave into social pressure to do something different and they regret it on their deathbed. The biggest decision of my life was not living in a cult. It's not. That was not challenging. There were things challenging. There's all this stuff that I've had to unwind with therapy and psychedelics and all sorts of stuff after. There's a lot of this nonsense that I've had to reorient my life. I've had to start over at 30 or whatever. But the most difficult part was coming to the place where I actually said, I'm leaving, because you have no idea how visceral those social connections feel and how lonely it is when you cut it off and you're truly alone. It's like, holy fuck, you almost question everything. Did I do the wrong thing? Should I go back? All that sort of stuff. But the one thing that kept me true to it was, I've got one life and I don't want to regret not living true to me. And if that means that I'm going to live the rest of my life alone in pursuit of living true to me, I'll take that bet, because I don't want to get to the end and say, I regret that I did not live true to myself. And then I'm also trusting, back to your point, that if I do that, I'm going to find my people. Like, I used to be afraid thinking I lost friends overnight. What I've since learned is like, no, they just weren't true friends. Because who are true friends? True friends are the people that you get to be yourself around. That you're like, you know, like they love on, like they accept you. They might give you shit, but that's great. You know, you feel safe to share your biggest dreams out loud or your insecurities. Like, that's okay. And because I didn't have that, I didn't lose anything. I gained, because I didn't have that baggage now. That by me, the more I leaned into what I really believed, people didn't want to talk to me anymore. Okay, good. Now I get to be myself as loud as I want to be, and be my own brand of weird and find other people that resonate with that brand of weird. And that's what's so exciting to me now that I'm living here, is I'm just starting to collect these cool people, these acquaintances, these comedians, these artists, these like people that just think differently. And I can just be myself. And it's okay. It's so freaking satisfying when you go from having to walk on eggshells and do everything the exact right way, never wear short sleeves or like dress a certain way, to then you just get to be yourself. So it's incredibly challenging in some sense, but it is incredibly the right move in the long run. If you can just have the courage, and that's what it is. It takes courage, because it's not sunshine and rainbows, but I still think it's worth it.
I think people, they take mortality for granted. Like, they don't understand that life is going to end. We are all going to die. And I think death really humbles people. It reminds you of how precious your existence is. And actually, as I've been doing interviews here on the podcast, I am making decisions differently now, because I am really paying more attention to my mortality and just thinking, like, if my life ended, or if I lost my ability to walk, or if I couldn't see, how would I make decisions differently today when I have all of these abilities? And when I realized that my decisions would be very different than from the life that I was building, even though a year ago that was like the right life and it was what I wanted, I realized a year later, wait a second, I need to question myself again, because my values have changed, my beliefs have changed, because I have allowed myself to change. And that's you being your most authentic self, because as you're exposed to new things, you're evolving, you're learning new things, you're going to change, and you need to keep up with that change, because it's very easy to get yourself off track. But when I started really putting mortality into the game, which is the first time I've ever done that, I really realized how precious life is. And I've been just having small moments of gratefulness, even if I'm like having breakfast or just laying in bed, just feeling so good. And so I think sometimes you need to bring mortality into the game, and you need to take that seriously, because that really changes the way that you behave. And I think that also sometimes it's what gives you the courage to start questioning your life and start questioning yourself.
I could not agree with you more. When I left and I started having these types of thoughts, I was incredibly depressed, because I don't get to be a god now. And I don't get to have all this big stuff. There's like, it was incredibly depressing that this could be it. But then a switch happened some point along the journey. That's just exactly what you're talking about, where I was like, wait a minute. If this is it, and here's the thing, it's a great thing to believe that we're going to continue on forever. And I'm not even discounting that as a possibility. But let's say this. The thing we know for sure is here.
What's physical.
We're here. The thing we know, that's what we know for sure. Yes, we hope there's something after, but we know this. And I was like, what if this is just all that it is? And instantly, all these moments mattered that you're talking about. This conversation is a conversation that is it's never been done, will never happen again quite like this. Like, the conversations with people, the kisses are sweeter, sunsets look better, food tastes more rich. Like, it genuinely goes from just going through life to where it almost feels deeper and richer to me, where I'm like, I'm going to die. And instead of that being depressing now, it's like, holy crap. Like, I'm on a plane and I'm looking out the window now and I'm like, this is crazy. Once upon a time, these hairless, knuckle-dragging apes that we are looked up and said, we want to do that someday. And because we are the freaking strange animal that we are in this universe, we figured it out, we did it, and we hijacked an entire other species technology, birds, and we do it better than they do, I might add. And that's crazy. But we get into these... Here's the other thing humans do. We take things for granted so quick, and we think it's just normal. And I think it's remembering your mortality lets you pause a little bit and be like, no, this is crazy. Life itself is crazy in the best way. It's bananas. It can be so freaking rich. And if you actually get this way, I mean, knock on wood, like even some of the hard stuff can get cool. Heartbreak, like the moments that I've wanted to end it all, like all those things in a way, and broadened perspective, strangely have some level of appreciation, because it's like, it's just depth. It's feeling in such an intense way.
It's another layer.
My point is just agreeing really with the mortality conversation, that it doesn't have to be depressing. It, like, when you realize that this could be it, you want to make the most of each second.
Hey guys, Carolina here. Before we wrap up the episode, you probably noticed that this episode is called Part 1, which does mean there will be a Part 2. It's going to be released on Monday, August 21st, so exactly a week after the release of the Part 1. The reason I decided to do this was there's just so much to cover here with Calvin, and after doing a poll on No Ducks Given Podcast Instagram, you guys decided that I should split the episode into two parts. Otherwise, it would have been over an hour and a half long. So I think this is good because it gives you an opportunity to process everything, think about everything. And part 2 of the episode is going to talk more about the moment Calvin realized he was in a cult and the process of getting out of it, and a little bit of his life after the cult. The next episode is actually going to be the last episode of season 1 of No Ducks Given podcast. So remember to follow us on all platforms and wherever you listen to your podcast so you stay up to date about the upcoming season 2. Thank you all for listening. I'm Carolina Risotto. This was No Ducks Given podcast. I'll see you on Monday for the final episode of season 1. Quack.